History remembers kings, but today you will remember the man who defied God. What happens when the most powerful empire on earth challenges the God of heaven? 10 plagues, each one worse than the last, each one a direct attack on Egypt's false gods. Water turned to blood, darkness swallowed the sun, and death knocked on every door. What if the plagues weren't just judgment, but a mirror? Pharaoh isn't just a man from history, he's a part of us, a voice we still listen to when we resist what's right. So if you think this is just about ancient Egypt, think again. This is about you, me, us. Stay to the end, because the final plague, it's the one that still knocks today. Right now, let's go explore together. Moses was born during one of the darkest chapters in Israel's history. His people were slaves in Egypt, beaten, broken, and silenced. And Pharaoh had ordered every Hebrew baby boy to be killed. But one mother defied the king. She placed her child in a basket and sent him down the Nile. And that river, once a symbol of death, delivered him into destiny. Pharaoh's daughter found the child and raised him in the palace as her own. So Moses grew up as a prince of Egypt, with Hebrew blood in his veins. But you can't silence the truth forever. One day, Moses saw an Egyptian strike a Hebrew slave, and rage erupted from within. He killed the man, and everything changed. Pharaoh hunted him, so Moses fled into the desert, rejected by both worlds. And for 40 years, he lived in silence. But God doesn't forget his promises, and he doesn't waste broken men. One day, while tending sheep, Moses saw a bush on fire, but it did not burn. From within the flames, God called his name. Moses, I have heard the cries of my people, and I am sending you to set them free. Moses trembled. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a speaker. He didn't even want the mission. But God doesn't choose the proud. He chooses the willing. So Moses returned, not as a prince, but as a prophet. Together with his brother Aaron, he stood before Pharaoh and declared, "Let my people go, so they may worship me. And if you refuse, Egypt will fall." Pharaoh's heart was hard, but he had no idea what was coming. Because when a king defies heaven, heaven strikes back. Pharaoh laughed. He mocked the message, and he hardened his heart. But heaven does not make empty threats when mercy is ignored. Judgment begins. This wasn't just a warning, it was a declaration of war between the pride of man and the power of God. And so it started. When God struck at the very heart of Egypt, water turned to blood, life disintegrated. The Nile, once the lifeblood of Egypt, had become a river of death. When Moses struck the water with his staff, it wasn't just a blow to the river. It was a verdict from heaven itself. The emerald waters darkened, then turned crimson, and finally, blood red. A thick, foul stench rose from the surface. Dead fish floated in the current. The river reeked of death, and the odor crept into every alley, every courtyard, every home. Panic spread like wildfire. People covered their faces, cried out in terror, and begged their gods to intervene. But no god answered. In the stillness of the palace, Pharaoh stood unmoved. The blood of the Nile lapped quietly beneath his golden throne. He didn't flinch. He didn't speak. Until finally he whispered with chilling defiance, "Blood, it's only a color. The river may turn red, but my heart will never change." What was once revered? Night fell, and with it the ground began to tremble. From the Nile they came, not by dozens, but by the millions. The frogs, pouring into the cities like a moving plague, jumping through alleys, sliding under doors, flooding into kitchens, bedrooms, even royal chambers. The cries of them echo in the darkness, deafening, endless, unsettling. Their slimy skin touches the legs, face, and fabric. The people shudder. What once symbolized life now reeked of chaos. In ancient Egypt, the frog was sacred, a sign of fertility, a blessing. But tonight, they were the face of defilement. Inside his palace, Pharaoh shivered just for a moment, as one landed on the arm of his throne. Then his eyes hardened, and he spoke with defiance. "Frogs, let them come. I will never bow." The frogs came and went, leaving behind silence, but not peace. The air grew heavier, the ground drier, and the hearts of the people more afraid. But Pharaoh, he still stood tall, unmoved, unbent. So the ground beneath him began to rise. Even the dust beneath my feet turns into a nightmare. In the heart of the desert, Moses raised his staff. He drew a line between heaven and earth, and the winds began to howl. A violent gust swept through the camp, kicking up sand, lifting dust into swirling columns. At first, it looked like a storm, but then the dust moved. It trembled. It breathed. It came alive. Tiny specks turned into gnats, biting, swarming, relentless. They weren't warriors, but they were everywhere. They poured into homes, into stables, into beds, into the eyes, ears, and mouths of man and beast alike. Egypt couldn't breathe, couldn't sleep, couldn't escape. Every sting left a mark. Every breath came with fear. The land was choking on a plague made of wings. Even Pharaoh's magicians stepped back. Their spells failed them. And for the first time, they whispered the words Pharaoh wouldn't. This is the finger of God. But Pharaoh clenched his fists. He didn't blink. He didn't bow. He hardened his heart. Once more, the gnats faded, but their memory lingered in every sore, every wound, every sleepless night. Egypt exhaled just for a moment, but heaven was not done. What had once been dust turned to gnats. Now, even the very air would rot. A new darkness was coming, not to bite, but to consume. When pollution is no longer just a sight. The air grew thick, heavy, almost toxic, and then from the edge of the horizon they came, flies, not just a few, not just a swarm, a plague. The sky, once blue, now seemed to darken. Clouds gathered in unnatural formation, casting a shadow over Egypt. And from that darkness, the flies descended. They were relentless. They poured into Egypt like a black cloud, darkening the sky, suffocating the light. They covered every window, every wall, every breath of wind. There was no escape. The people of Egypt ran into their homes, desperate to shut the doors and windows, but the flies found a way in. They crawled into the food, sinking into the bread, the fruits, the water jars. They swarmed over everything, over the bodies of the living and the dead. The stench was unbearable. It filled the air, clogged the nostrils, drove the people to madness. Even the royal chambers, once sacred, were no sanctuary. The flies found their way into Pharaoh's palace, into the very heart of his domain. The royal kitchens, the throne room, the gardens, everywhere. Everywhere was covered. The horror was complete. The people cried out in desperation. They screamed for mercy, begging Pharaoh to do something, anything. For the first time since this ordeal began, Pharaoh lost control. His once unshakable confidence was broken. He stumbled to his knees, calling out to Moses, his voice trembling with the fear he had long denied. His pride, the very thing that had kept him defiant, was now shattered. Pharaoh's voice cracked, and with it, his mask of power. Pray to your God. Tell him to make them go away. Take them from us. Take them away. Moses stood still, watching the king. His face, as always, was calm, resolute. This moment was not the first time Pharaoh had pleaded, but it was the first time Moses saw Pharaoh's fear. He had seen Pharaoh's arrogance, his cruelty. Now he saw the king as a man, vulnerable. But Moses did not respond immediately. He raised his hands and turned his face to the heavens. He prayed not for Pharaoh, but for Egypt, for the people who were suffering, for the land that had been desecrated by Pharaoh's pride. And as Moses finished his prayer, it happened. The flies vanished. Gone. Just like that. The air, once thick with buzzing and decay, fell into an eerie silence. The buzzing, which had been a constant presence, was no more. Pharaoh stood, stunned, his eyes scanning the empty palace, the quiet streets outside. The people dared to breathe freely again. The air was clean. But it didn't feel like victory, because when the skies cleared, so did Pharaoh's fear. For a moment, Pharaoh stood there, looking at Moses as if seeing him for the first time. But that moment was fleeting. The king's face hardened, his eyes grew cold again. He did not bow, he did not surrender. He clenched his fists, and in the silence that followed, he made a decision. His heart hardened once more. The challenge continued. Moses did not flinch. He had seen Pharaoh's pride before. He had seen it in the way Pharaoh defied him, in the way he mocked the God of Israel. But Moses knew this moment would come. The moment when Pharaoh would accept no defeat from heaven, no defeat from anyone. But Pharaoh's refusal would be his downfall. The silence that followed the plague of flies was not peace. It was not the calm before a storm. It was the silence before a greater judgment. Moses stood in the palace of Pharaoh, but his mind was on Egypt, on the people who had no choice but to suffer. Moses had done what he was sent to do, but Pharaoh refused to bend, refused to see the truth. And so, the next blow was inevitable. For what Pharaoh didn't understand was this: each plague was not just a punishment, it was a warning. A warning he ignored. God had touched the air. Now, he would touch the earth. It was not just the living that would suffer. The very creatures man had tamed, the very things Pharaoh had ruled over with arrogance, would fall. In the stillness of the palace, Moses turned to leave, knowing what was coming next. He had delivered the message. He had prayed for mercy. But Pharaoh would not listen, and Egypt would fall. Moses stood in the heat of the day, watching the sun set over the Egyptian horizon. He could feel the weight of the coming days pressing down on him, but he knew he had to continue. He had to finish what he started. The next plague would be worse, far worse. But this was not about Egypt. This was about the heart of Pharaoh. It was about the refusal to listen, the refusal to bow, when the creatures fell one by one. But instead of the rhythm of grinding grain or the laughter of children playing in the fields, only one sound echoed across the land of Egypt: the haunting cries of dying animals. The cattle fell like soldiers on a battlefield, one after another. Bulls, donkeys, camels, sheep, goats, all collapsed, lifeless, their eyes wide, their breath gone, as if they couldn't understand why life had left them so suddenly. The fields grew silent, the barns empty, and Egypt's economy crumbled in a single night. Yet while death covered the land, there was one place untouched: Goshen, where the Hebrews lived. Not a single animal harmed, not by chance, but by choice, by design. It was a message clearer than any word. But Pharaoh's heart did not soften. He stood among the corpses, unblinking. Pride still burned in him, even as Egypt lay dying. The fields lay still, the livestock gone. The cries of the dying had faded into silence. But heaven had not finished. The earth had suffered. Now, it was the sky's turn to speak. Egypt thought it had seen the worst, but judgment was just beginning. What comes next would not crawl or swarm, but fall from above. When the skin is cracked and painful, a handful of dark ashes was thrown into the air. Like a curse from heaven, it rose into the atmosphere, swirling with dust. Immediately, strange boils appeared on the skin of all those struck by this wrath. From the poorest citizens to the high priests, from mighty warriors to the proud kings, each person endured excruciating pain, the black boils, full of pus, spreading rapidly, covering their bodies. The screams echoed throughout Egypt. The cries and wails of the suffering people were like the tormented souls in agony. No one could escape the excruciating pain. No one could avoid the devastation. Everyone collapsed, lying in pools of blood and pus, their bodies weak, unable to fight back against the cruelty of the plague. In the midst of this darkness, Pharaoh stood firm, his hands clenched into fists, his eyes bloodshot and full of arrogance, showing no sign of fear. With a defiant voice, he declared, "I will never bow down, even if the world falls. I am the king of Egypt." Yet, as the people knelt in agony, pleading for salvation from the gods, Pharaoh remained unmoved. He looked across the land, seeing the wounds on his body and those around him, but his gaze never wavered. In Pharaoh's eyes, only unwavering resolve and unyielding determination remained. But the pain of the Egyptian people couldn't hide the fear beginning to creep into Pharaoh's mind. Though he said nothing, his resolve was starting to crack. Pharaoh clenched his fists and gritted his teeth, whispering, "This will not make me bow. I am Pharaoh, and these will have to suffer." Pharaoh believed that the wrath of God had reached its peak, but he didn't know that the worst was yet to come. Smooth transition. At this moment, Pharaoh still held his arrogance and confidence, but another sign of his downfall was drawing near. As his pride grew stronger, a new trial approached, stronger than ever before. Pharaoh had no idea that no matter how determined he remained, God was always waiting for the right time to execute judgment. The wrath Pharaoh had faced was not the final one. Will Pharaoh remain stubborn, or will he finally bow to the wrath of God? And if he doesn't change, does Egypt have any hope left in the final trial? Stay tuned to find out. This time, the wrath came from above, not a storm, not a downpour, but a tear in the sky itself. The heavens split open, thunder roared like the voice of a furious God, and then hail began to fall. But not like any hail Egypt had ever known. Chunks of ice the size of fists came crashing down like stones from the stars. They shattered rooftops, crushed trees, killed anyone caught beneath them. And then came the fire and ice, falling from the sky together, opposites, united in judgment. It was a sight no man had ever seen, and one they would never forget. This was not weather. This was a warning. Before the first stone fell, Moses had spoken. Seek shelter, for what you are about to witness is only the beginning. The storm ended. The ice melted, the fire died, but the devastation remained. Fields lay in ruin, crops crushed, trees splintered, hope shattered. Egypt had nothing left to lose. But God was not yet done. The sky stilled for only a moment, a breath between plagues, and then it moved again, not with clouds, not with rain, but with wings. When the land is no longer green, the sky grew dark, but not from nightfall. A strange wind swept across Egypt, and on the horizon a shadow moved, not clouds, wings, locusts. They came in waves, a living storm. They swarmed the fields. They devoured what little was left. After the hail had crushed the land, no leaves remained, no green, no life, only dust and ruin. Egypt stood on the edge of collapse. Even Pharaoh's own advisors could bear it no longer. They fell to their knees. They begged, "Please, Your Majesty, let them go. Egypt is already lost." But Pharaoh did not speak. He clenched his fists and stared into the distance. The locusts came, and what little remained of Egypt, they consumed. Green vanished. Hope crumbled. Even the air felt emptied of life. The land was stripped bare, a hollow echo of the empire it once was. But heaven was not done. The plagues had torn Egypt's body. Now it would reach for its soul. The next blow would not be loud. It would not bite, sting, or fall. It would simply take the light. This is not the night, but the silence of the sky. Egypt fell into darkness, but this was no ordinary night. It was a darkness you could feel, heavy, thick, as if the sky itself had collapsed. Light vanished. Lamps would not burn. Fires refused to catch. And people could no longer see one another. The entire nation froze in fear. No one moved. No one spoke. For 3 days, Egypt held its breath, swallowed whole by a silent kind of hell. But in the land of Goshen, where the Hebrews lived, there was still light, a flicker of hope, but not for Egypt. This was no mere miracle. It was a final warning, because after the darkness comes death. The darkness lasted for 3 days. Not a word was spoken. Not a step was taken. Egypt sat still, in fear. But the darkness was just a warning. The final blow had not yet come, and when the sun finally returned, it did not bring light. It brought loss. Heaven had been patient. Now it would reclaim what belonged to it. The final scream from the throne is when Egypt truly kneels. That night, Egypt fell silent. No wind, no voices, just a waiting, heavy, dreadful. And then it began. A single scream pierced the stillness, then another and another, until the streets of Egypt echoed with sorrow. In every home, from the royal palace to the smallest slave hut, the firstborn was gone. Boys, babies, even the animals, every firstborn taken, except for the homes marked with blood, the blood of a lamb, painted on the doorposts. The angel of death had passed by, but not without leaving silence in his wake. And Pharaoh, the man who had defied God again and again, finally broke. Kneeling beside the lifeless body of his own son, he lifted his voice, not in command, but in surrender. Go, take your people, take your God, just go. What remains after 10 plagues? Egypt didn't fall because of swords. It fell because of pride. The 10 plagues weren't just acts of judgment. They were warnings, clear, repeated, merciful. And the real question isn't, why did God bring disaster? It's, how many chances did Pharaoh ignore before the cost was too great to bear? We don't live in ancient Egypt, but we still make Pharaoh's choice. Every time we ignore the voice that tells us to turn back, to soften, to change. Today, the darkness might not fall from the sky. It may rise quietly from within. From bitterness, pride, and fear, we refuse to release. And the death we face might not take a body, but the part of us that could have lived differently. Don't wait for everything to collapse. Listen while the warning is still gentle. Respond before the silence is final, because the most powerful message of the plagues isn't about Egypt's past. It's about our future and the choices we still have right now. The 10 plagues weren't just history. They were a mirror held up to every hardened heart, every ignored voice, every missed second chance. Blood in the river, frogs in the palace, darkness that could be felt. And finally, the cry of a father too late to change. The warning signs didn't stop with Pharaoh. They still echo today through storms, silence, and small moments. The question is, will we listen? If this story stirred something in you, don't let it fade. Share it. Comment what moment hit you the hardest. And hit that subscribe button to follow more stories like this. Because the greatest message of the 10 plagues isn't about judgment. It's about choosing mercy before it's too late.